The pursuit began in earnest as the first helicopter swept over the dry riverbed, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like a sword. Myra pressed herself against the rocky wall of the ravine, feeling the downdraft from the rotors as the aircraft passed overhead. The pilot was skilled, methodical, working a search pattern that would eventually find her if she remained stationary. She waited until the helicopter moved toward the eastern edge of the riverbed before resuming her movement north. The caves were still over a kilometer away, and she could hear additional aircraft joining the search. Whatever resources the shadow operation commanded, they were bringing everything to bear on recapturing her. The communicator crackled with an incoming transmission. "Steelwing, this is Control. We're monitoring multiple aircraft in your area. What's your status?" "Mobile and undetected," Myra replied quietly. "But they're closing the net. I estimate 30 minutes before they lock down the entire sector." "Understood. Extraction team is moving to an alternate rendezvous point. Proceed to grid reference 347-821. How copy?" Myra checked her map, locating the new coordinates. The alternate site was closer but in more exposed terrain. Someone had made the calculation that speed was more important than concealment. "Copy new rendezvous. ETA 15 minutes. Steelwing, be advised that the intelligence package you transmitted is being analyzed at the highest levels. What you recovered tonight will change everything." The words gave Myra strength even as exhaustion began to wear at her endurance. Johnson's sacrifice had meaning beyond just buying her time. It had helped expose a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of the military she'd sworn to serve. The terrain began to change as she moved north, the rocky riverbed giving way to more open ground that offered less concealment but allowed faster movement. She could see the lights of the search helicopters sweeping back and forth across the valley, their pilots growing more aggressive as they realized their target had escaped the initial containment. A new sound reached her ears, the distinctive whine of jet engines. Someone had called in fixed-wing aircraft, probably drones equipped with advanced sensors. The search was escalating beyond anything she'd expected, confirming that the stakes were even higher than she'd imagined. The communicator buzzed with another transmission. "All units, this is Raven Leader. Target is mobile and heading north. Implement Protocol 7 immediately." Myra didn't recognize the code designation, but the tone of the transmission was ominous. She increased her pace, driven by the instinct that whatever Protocol 7 involved, she didn't want to be caught in the open when it was activated. The answer came in the form of illumination flares deployed across the entire valley. The night sky erupted in brilliant white light, turning the landscape into a stark tableau of shadows and harsh illumination. There was nowhere to hide now. The entire area was lit up like a football stadium. "Steelwing, this is Control. We're seeing flare deployment across your sector. You need to reach the rendezvous point immediately." "Roger that," Myra replied, breaking into a run. Stealth was no longer an option. Speed was her only chance of survival. The sound of rotor blades grew louder behind her, and she could hear the tactical teams coordinating their movements over the radio frequencies. They were closing in from multiple directions, using the flare light to guide their approach. "Contact, contact. I have visual on the target bearing 270, range 400 meters. The transmission galvanized the entire search operation. Myra could hear helicopters converging on her position, their pilots calling out updates as they maneuvered for the best attack angles. She was running out of time and options. The rendezvous point appeared ahead, a cluster of rocks that provided minimal concealment but would have to suffice. She could see movement among the boulders, figures in tactical gear who she hoped were friendlies rather than enemies. "Steelwing, this is Echo 6. I have you in sight. Move to my position now." The voice was professional calm, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Myra adjusted her course toward the voice, praying that she was running towards salvation rather than another trap. The first bullet struck the ground around her as she dove behind the rocks. The search teams had switched from capture to kill mode, their weapons firing with deadly precision. Echo 6 returned fire immediately, his rifle chattering in controlled bursts. "Steelwing, are you hit?" he called out. "Negative," Myra replied, checking herself for wounds. "But they're not taking prisoners." "Copy that, we're extracting now. Stay close and follow my lead." Echo 6 was a staff sergeant, his uniform bearing the same unmarked patches as Park's. He moved with the fluid grace of a special operations veteran, his weapon trained on the approaching search teams. Behind him, two other soldiers provided covering fire while a fourth worked frantically with communication equipment. "Overwatch, this is Echo 6. Package is secured. Request immediate extraction." Echo 6, Overwatch. Extraction bird is 3 minutes out. Can you hold your position? Affirmative, but we're taking heavy fire. Multiple aircraft inbound. Estimate platoon strength ground force. The battle was escalating rapidly. Myra could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen positions, the search teams coordinating their attack with professional precision. But Echo 6's team was fighting back with equal skill, their weapons creating a protective barrier around the rendezvous point. "Steelwing, we need to move to the extraction point," Echo 6 called out. "It's 100 meters north, but we'll be exposed." "What about covering fire?" Myra asked. "We'll provide what we can, but once we move, we're committed. No going back." The sound of approaching rotor blades grew louder, but these engines had a different signature than the search helicopters. The extraction bird was coming in fast and low, its pilot skilled enough to navigate the hostile airspace. "This is Ghost Rider," the pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "I have multiple aircraft in the area. This is going to be a hot extraction." Echo 6 looked at Myra, his expression grim but determined. "Ma'am, when I give the word, we move fast and we don't stop. Are you ready?" "Lead the way, Sergeant." "Go, go, go." The team exploded into motion, their movements coordinated through countless hours of training. Myra stayed close to Echo 6, trusting his experience to guide them through the chaos. Behind them, the search teams opened up with everything they had, their weapons lighting up the night sky. The extraction helicopter appeared over the ridge, its door gunner laying down suppressing fire as it descended toward the pickup zone. The pilot was flying at the edge of his aircraft's performance envelope, the helicopter dancing through the air to avoid the ground fire. 30 seconds, Ghost Rider called out. "I can't hold this position long." Echo 6's team reached the extraction point just as the helicopter touched down. The door gunner continued firing, his weapon creating a cone of protection around the landing zone. But the search teams were adjusting their tactics, moving to flank the extraction site. "RPG, RPG," someone screamed. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked through the air, missing the helicopter by meters but close enough to rock the aircraft with its explosive blast. Ghost Rider fought to maintain control, his voice strained but professional, taking fire from multiple positions. "We need to move now." Myra dove through the helicopter's open door, followed closely by Echo 6 and his team. The aircraft was lifting off even before everyone was fully inside, the pilot's skill keeping them alive as ground fire erupted around them. "This is Ghost Rider. Package is secure, heading to safe haven." The helicopter banked sharply, using the terrain to mask their escape route. Myra looked back at the valley, seeing the search team's lights still sweeping the area. They would continue hunting, but their target had escaped. Echo 6 handed her a headset so she could communicate over the aircraft's internal system. "Ma'am, that was too close. They came at us with everything they had." "Johnson bought us the time we needed," Myra replied. "His sacrifice saved all of us." "Who was Johnson?" "A soldier who chose to do the right thing," Myra said simply. "He died protecting the truth." The helicopter flew through the night, carrying its precious cargo toward a destination that remained classified. But for the first time in 3 days, Myra felt something approaching hope. The intelligence she'd gathered was in the hands of people who could use it, and she was still alive to testify about what she'd seen. The mark of steel on her uniform caught the cabin light, reminding her of the responsibility that came with survival. She'd been given a second chance at life, and she intended to make it count. "Control, this is Steelwing," she said into the communicator. "Package delivered. What's our next move?" "Steelwing, you've done more than anyone had a right to expect. The next phase is out of your hands." "With respect, Control, this is my fight now. I've seen what these people are capable of, and I won't rest until they're stopped." There was a pause before the reply came. "Understood, Steelwing. We hoped you'd feel that way. Welcome to the Resistance." The helicopter flew on through the darkness, carrying a woman who had died and been reborn as something more dangerous than her enemies had imagined. The war between truth and corruption had claimed another casualty, but this one was fighting back. Captain Myra Steelwing Thorne was no longer running from her enemies. She was hunting them, and she had the tools to bring them down. The mark of steel had become a symbol of defiance, and the Resistance had found its most dangerous weapon. The night was ending, but the real battle was just beginning. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, Myra liked her chances. The safe house was located in a nondescript compound outside Kabul, its walls high enough to discourage casual observation, and its security discreet but thorough. Myra had been debriefed for 6 hours straight, her testimony recorded and cross-referenced with the intelligence data she'd recovered from the command post. The full scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The photographs and communication intercepts revealed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon, involving weapons sales, falsified intelligence reports, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the network's senior coordinator, sat across from Myra in the secure conference room. She was a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles that couldn't be won through conventional means. "Captain Thorne, what you've provided us will bring down at least a dozen high-ranking officials," Hayes said. "The evidence is conclusive, undeniable, but prosecution will take time and these people have resources." "What kind of resources?" Myra asked. "The kind that can make inconvenient witnesses disappear," Hayes replied grimly. "Your official death has been confirmed through multiple channels. As far as the world knows, Captain Myra Thorne died in a helicopter crash 3 days ago." The implications were clear. Myra's resurrection would have to be carefully orchestrated to maximize impact while minimizing the risk of retaliation. Coming back from the dead was complicated when your enemies controlled the official narrative. "What about my daughter?" Myra asked. "She thinks I'm dead." "Alina is safe," Hayes assured her. "We've had discreet surveillance on her since your disappearance, and she's being protected by assets within the system. But contacting her directly would expose both of you to danger." The separation from her daughter was the hardest part of this entire ordeal. Myra had survived 3 days in hostile territory, fought off assassination attempts, and exposed a conspiracy that threatened national security. But she couldn't hold her own child or tell her that everything would be all right. "How long before I can see her?" Myra asked. "That depends on how quickly we can neutralize the threat," Hayes replied. "The people you've exposed won't go quietly. They'll fight back with everything they have, and they'll target anyone who threatens their interests." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Park entered, his expression grave. "Colonel, we have a problem. The search operation in the valley has been expanded. They're bringing in additional resources." Hayes turned to Myra. "It seems your escape has caused quite a stir. They're not giving up easily." What kind of additional resources? Myra asked. Satellite surveillance, electronic warfare aircraft, and a full battalion of special operations troops, Park replied. They're treating this as a national security emergency. The escalation was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it confirmed the importance of the intelligence she'd recovered. Terrifying because it demonstrated the lengths her enemies would go to silence her permanently. They're scared, Myra observed. They wouldn't commit those resources unless they thought I could bring them down. Which you can, Hayes confirmed. But first we need to get you somewhere safe while we prepare our offensive. The plan was ambitious but necessary. Myra would be relocated to a secure facility where she could work with investigators to build an airtight case against the conspirators. Meanwhile, the network would begin leaking selected information to trusted journalists and congressional allies. What about the extraction team? Myra asked. Echo 6 and his people risked their lives to get me out. They're safe, Park assured her. The network takes care of its own, but you're right to be concerned. They're all marked men now just like you. The weight of responsibility settled on Myra's shoulders. Her decision to fight back had put other people at risk, brave soldiers who'd chosen to stand with her against corruption. She couldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. Colonel, I want to be more than just a witness, she said. I want to be part of the operation that brings these people down. Hayes studied her carefully. Captain, you've already done more than anyone could expect. You've provided us with the evidence we need. The rest is intelligence work, not combat operations. With respect, ma'am, this is still my fight. I know these people, I know their capabilities, and I know what they're capable of. You need that knowledge. The colonel's expression softened slightly. What exactly are you proposing? Let me work with your intelligence analysts. Help them understand what they're dealing with. These aren't just corrupt officials. They're experienced operators who know how to fight dirty. Hayes considered the proposal. It would be dangerous. If your involvement becomes known, you'd be a target for the rest of your life. I'm already a target, Myra replied. But now I have the chance to do something about it. The decision was made with the kind of institutional weight that came from years of fighting shadow wars. Myra would remain officially dead while working with the network to expose the conspiracy. It was a role that suited her perfectly. She'd always been more comfortable in the shadows than in the spotlight. The briefing room became her new command center, its walls covered with photographs, documents, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of corruption spanning multiple administrations. The conspiracy was vast, but it wasn't invulnerable. Every organization had weak points, and Myra was determined to find them. The key is General Morrison, she explained to the assembled analysts. He's the one who authorized the arms sales, but he's also the most paranoid. He'll have kept records of every transaction, every communication, every meeting. If we can get to his files, we can expose the entire network. The challenge was accessing Morrison's private records without alerting him to the investigation. The general was a skilled operator with decades of experience in covert operations. He would have taken precautions against exactly this kind of exposure. What about his communications? One of the analysts asked. Everyone makes mistakes in their electronic traffic. Morrison's too smart for that, Myra replied. He'll use cutouts, coded language, and secure channels. But he has a weakness. He's a control freak. He won't delegate anything important, which means he'll have to handle certain communications personally. The analysis continued for hours, building a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy and its vulnerabilities. Myra found herself energized by the intellectual challenge, using skills she developed during years of tactical planning and mission analysis. But the real breakthrough came when Park returned with intelligence from the field. The search operation has been called off, he reported. They're claiming they found enough remains to confirm the pilot's death. What kind of remains? Hayes asked. Burned flight suit fragments, personal effects, dental records, Park replied. All fabricated but convincing enough to satisfy the official investigation. The news was both liberating and disturbing. Liberating because it meant the immediate threat of capture had diminished. Disturbing because it demonstrated the sophistication of the conspiracy's cover-up capabilities. They're cutting their losses, Myra observed. They've decided it's easier to fake my death than to risk exposure by continuing the search. Which gives us time to prepare our counterattack, Hayes added. But we need to move quickly. Once they realize you're still alive, they'll come after you with everything they have. The next phase of the operation would require careful coordination between multiple elements of the network. Journalists would be briefed on the story, congressional allies would be provided with evidence, and law enforcement agencies would be prepared to act on the intelligence. But the most important element was Myra herself. As the primary witness to the conspiracy, her testimony would be crucial to any successful prosecution. She would have to emerge from the shadows and face her enemies directly. "Are you ready for that?" Hayes asked. "Once you surface, there's no going back. You'll be in danger for the rest of your life." Myra thought about Elena, about the world she wanted to leave for her daughter. A world where truth mattered more than convenience, where justice was more important than profit, where soldiers died protecting freedom rather than protecting secrets. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Let's bring these bastards down." The mark of steel on her uniform had become more than just a symbol. It was a declaration of war against everyone who'd betrayed the trust placed in them. The conspiracy had made a fatal mistake when they'd tried to silence Captain Myra Thorne. They'd awakened something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The real battle was about to begin, and this time the ghost of Steelwing would be hunting them. The media offensive began at dawn, carefully coordinated across multiple platforms to maximize impact while minimizing the opportunity for suppression. The story broke simultaneously in 3 major newspapers, 2 television networks, and a dozen online publications, creating an information firestorm that couldn't be contained. The headlines were devastating. Pentagon conspiracy exposed by dead pilot's ghost. Weapons sales scandal reaches highest military levels. American officers murdered to protect corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable, the implications staggering. Myra watched the coverage from the safe house, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The conspiracy was finally exposed, but the backlash would be swift and brutal. Her enemies wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. "Congressional hearings have been scheduled," Hayes reported. "The House Armed Services Committee wants to hear your testimony within the week." "What about the Pentagon's response?" Myra asked. "Predictable," Park replied. "They're claiming the documents are fabricated, the witnesses are unreliable, and the whole thing is a foreign disinformation campaign." The defensive strategy was exactly what Myra had expected. When caught in an indefensible position, the standard response was to attack the credibility of the accusers and question the authenticity of the evidence. But the network had prepared for this contingency. "We have corroborating evidence from multiple sources," Hayes explained. "Financial records, communication intercepts, witness testimony from other survivors. They can't discredit everyone." The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension in the room. Hayes answered, her expression growing increasingly grim as she listened to the caller. "That was our contact in the Justice Department," she said after hanging up. "There's been a development. General Morrison was found dead in his office an hour ago, apparent suicide." The news hit Myra like a physical blow. Morrison's death eliminated their primary target, but also raised disturbing questions about the conspiracy's reach. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desolate Afghan valley as Captain Myra Steelwing Thorne crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, her breathing steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The distant thrum of rotor blades grew louder with each passing second, and she knew they were coming for her. But what they didn't know, what none of them understood, was that she had already died once in these mountains. Everything after that was borrowed time. The radio crackled to life in her earpiece. Viper 6, this is Blackhawk lead. We have visual on the crash site. No movement detected. The voice was young, confident, untested. Myra pressed her back against the ancient stone, feeling the familiar weight of her sidearm against her hip. 3 days ago, she had been piloting a routine reconnaissance mission when surface-to-air missiles had torn her Apache apart like paper. The official reports would list her as KIA, killed in action. But Myra Thorne had a habit of disappointing bureaucrats. She closed her eyes and let the sound of approaching helicopters wash over her. 4 distinct signatures, probably A-60 Blackhawks, flying in tactical formation. Standard search and rescue protocol, except this wasn't a rescue mission. This was something else entirely. The encrypted frequency chatter she'd intercepted during her 36-hour trek through hostile territory had made that crystal clear. Someone wanted her found, but not necessarily alive. The irony wasn't lost on her. Myra had spent 15 years proving herself in a profession that measured worth in split-second decisions and steel nerves. She'd flown combat missions over Iraq, pulled Marines out of impossible situations in Syria, and earned decorations that most pilots could only dream of. Yet here she was, hiding in a hole like a wounded animal, waiting for her own people to either save her or bury her. The helicopters were close now, their rotor wash beginning to stir the dust around her position. Myra opened her eyes and studied the makeshift shelter she'd constructed from aircraft debris and local materials. Her survival training had kicked in automatically, but something deeper had guided her actions over the past 3 days. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, but she'd learned to trust the voice that whispered warnings in the darkness. The first Blackhawk crested the ridge, its distinctive silhouette stark against the morning sky. Myra held her breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she'd live to see another sunset. The pilot's voice echoed through the valley. Blackhawk lead to all units. We have confirmation on the crash site. Initiating ground search pattern. That's when Myra saw it, the small but unmistakable marking on the lead helicopter's fuselage. A steel wing insignia that shouldn't have been there. Captain Myra Thorne had earned her call sign, Steel Wing, during a night mission over Baghdad when enemy fire had shredded her Apache's main rotor. While lesser pilots might have panicked, Myra had performed an auto-rotation landing that saved both her life and that of her gunner. The maneuver required nerves of steel and wings of equal strength, hence the nickname that had followed her through 3 deployments. But the insignia she now observed on the approaching Blackhawk was different. It was older, more weathered, and it belonged to a unit that had been officially disbanded 5 years ago. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had been her first assignment out of flight school, and she knew every aircraft in their fleet. This helicopter bore the markings of Ghost Company, a black ops unit that had supposedly been dissolved after a classified incident in Yemen. The contradiction sent ice through her veins. Either someone was playing an elaborate game, or her presumed death had activated protocols she'd never known existed. Myra's finger traced the outline of her own steel wing patch, sewn into the fabric of her flight suit. The emblem had been a gift from her mentor, Colonel Marcus Rivera, who died in a training accident 3 months after she'd earned her wings. Steel doesn't bend, he'd told her during their final conversation. It either holds or it breaks clean. The lead Blackhawk began its descent, kicking up a dust storm that obscured Myra's vision. She could hear the crew chief's voice over the radio. Blackhawk lead, we're beginning our approach. Thermal scans show no life signs in the immediate area. The professional calm in his voice was reassuring, but Myra had learned to read between the lines of military communication. These weren't search and rescue specialists. These were operators. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows as the helicopter touched down 50 meters from her position. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons drawn but not raised. They were looking for something specific, and Myra had a sinking suspicion that something was her. The team leader, a staff sergeant with the weathered face of a career soldier, gestured toward the wreckage of her Apache. "Spread out and sweep the area," he commanded. "Command wants confirmation on the pilot's status. No stone unturned." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd conducted similar operations before. Myra watched as the four-man team began their methodical search, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the valley floor. Myra's position provided excellent concealment, but she knew it was only a matter of time before their search pattern brought them to her location. She needed to make a decision: reveal herself to what might be a legitimate rescue team, or continue hiding from potential assassins wearing friendly uniforms. The radio chatter continued to flow through her earpiece, and gradually, a picture began to emerge. References to package retrieval and clean extraction suggested this was more than a simple recovery mission. Someone higher up the chain of command had very specific plans for Captain Myra Thorne, and those plans apparently required her to remain officially dead. She thought about her daughter, Alina, who believed her mother was serving a routine deployment in Germany. The carefully constructed cover story had been designed to protect her from the reality of Myra's actual missions. If these soldiers were here to ensure her permanent silence, Alina would grow up believing her mother had died in a training accident. The thought ignited a cold fury in Myra's chest. The search team had found her helmet, the ceramic shell cracked but still bearing her name tape. She watched the team leader examine it carefully before speaking into his radio. "Blackhawk lead, we have positive ID on the pilot's gear, still no body." The response from the helicopter was immediate. "Copy that, Sergeant. Expand the search perimeter." She couldn't have gone far. Myra's lips curved into a grim smile. They were wrong about that last part. She'd covered nearly 30 kilometers in the past 3 days, using skills learned during survival training and refined through years of operating in hostile territory. The landscape of Afghanistan had become as familiar to her as her own backyard, and she'd used every advantage it offered. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. One of the soldiers was moving directly toward her position, his rifle held in a ready position. Myra's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm, but something in the soldier's movements gave her pause. He was walking too deliberately, almost as if he knew exactly where she was hiding. When he reached the stone wall, he stopped just short of her position and spoke in a low voice. "Captain Thorne, if you can hear me, I need you to know that not everyone in this unit is here for the same reason." The words were carefully chosen, designed to convey information without revealing too much to listening ears. "My name is Sergeant First Class David Park. I served with Colonel Rivera in Iraq." The mention of her mentor's name sent a shock through Myra's system. Rivera had been dead for 8 years, killed in what had been ruled a helicopter malfunction. But if this soldier had served with him, it meant he knew about the informal network of pilots and ground crew who'd worked together in the most dangerous corners of the world. Rivera had called them his steel family, bound by shared experiences and unbreakable loyalty. Park continued speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "The colonel told me about his best pilot, the one who could land a broken bird on a postage stamp. He said she had a daughter who liked to draw pictures of helicopters." The detail was so specific, so personal, that Myra knew it could only have come from Rivera himself. Her mentor had been one of the few people who'd known about Alina's artistic interests. "If you're listening, Captain, you need to know that your death has been officially confirmed. But there are people who believe you're still alive, and they're not all friendly." Park's words carried the weight of inside knowledge. "The unit that sent us isn't the unit that's supposed to be here. Someone's playing a very dangerous game, and you're the prize." Myra made her decision. She stood slowly, her hands visible but ready to move if necessary. Park's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there along with something else, respect tinged with concern. "Sergeant Park," she said quietly, "I think it's time we had a conversation." The young soldier nodded and spoke into his radio. "Blackhawk lead, negative contact at this position. Continuing search pattern." Then he gestured for Myra to follow him deeper into the rocks, away from the open area where his teammates were working. They moved in silence, two professionals who understood the value of discretion. Once they were out of sight, Park turned to face her. "Ma'am, I need you to understand the situation you're in. Colonel Rivera didn't die in an accident. He discovered something that certain people wanted to keep buried, and he paid the price for it. Before he died, he set up a network of people who could help pilots in situations like yours." Myra absorbed this information, her mind racing through the implications. If Rivera had been murdered, it meant that the corruption she'd long suspected within the military hierarchy was far more extensive than she'd imagined. It also meant that her current predicament was connected to something much larger than a simple mission gone wrong. "What kind of network?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her thoughts. Park glanced around nervously before answering. "People in key positions who can provide information, resources, extraction if necessary. The colonel called it Steel Guardian. He said that the military sometimes forgets that its greatest asset isn't technology or weapons, it's the people who operate them. And sometimes those people need protection from their own institution." The concept was both reassuring and terrifying. Myra had always prided herself on being a soldier who followed orders and trusted the system. But the events of the past 3 days had shattered that faith. If her own military was hunting her, then perhaps Rivera's underground network was her only hope for survival. "What do you know about why they want me dead?" she asked directly. There was no point in dancing around the obvious conclusion. If this was a legitimate rescue mission, Park wouldn't be speaking in coded whispers. Park's expression darkened. "3 weeks ago, you flew a reconnaissance mission over the Khyber Pass. Your cameras captured something that certain people in Washington would prefer to keep secret. The official report says your mission was routine surveillance, but the encrypted files you transmitted paint a different picture." Myra's memory flashed back to that flight. She'd been tasked with photographing suspected Taliban supply routes, but her cameras had captured something else entirely, a convoy of vehicles that didn't match any known insurgent patterns. The equipment had been too sophisticated, too well-maintained. At the time, she'd filed a detailed report and assumed someone higher up the chain would investigate. "What was in those photos?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Evidence of weapons sales to groups that are supposed to be our enemies," Park replied grimly. "High-level officials profiting from arms deals that directly threaten American lives. Your photos showed serial numbers on weapons that could be traced back to Pentagon contracts. Someone decided that information was worth killing for." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Her Apache hadn't been shot down by Taliban missiles. It had been targeted by people who wanted to ensure her silence. The timing of the attack, the precision of the strikes, the convenient loss of all mission data, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to eliminate a witness. "So what happens now?" Myra asked. "My death has been confirmed, which means I'm officially a ghost. That gives me certain advantages, but it also means I can't exactly walk into a U.S. embassy and ask for help." Park nodded. "The network has protocols for situations like this. We can get you out of Afghanistan, provide you with a new identity, set you up somewhere safe. But it means leaving everything behind, your career, your life, your daughter." The mention of Alina hit Myra like a physical blow. She joined the military to provide her daughter with a better life, to show her that women could excel in any field they chose. The thought of abandoning Alina, of letting her grow up believing her mother was dead, was almost unbearable. "There has to be another way," she said firmly. "I won't abandon my daughter, and I won't let these bastards get away with murder." Park studied her face, seeing the determination that had earned her the call sign Steelwing. The colonel said you were stubborn. He also said that was your greatest strength. He paused, considering his next words carefully. There might be another option, but it's dangerous. We could help you gather evidence, build a case that would expose the corruption, but it would mean staying dead until we can guarantee your safety. Myra felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. What kind of evidence? Financial records, communication intercepts, witness testimony. The kind of information that could bring down everyone involved in this conspiracy. Park's voice carried a note of excitement. The network has been gathering intelligence for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Your photos might be the final piece of the puzzle. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Park quickly adopted a casual stance, as if he'd been examining the rocks for signs of passage. One of his teammates appeared around the corner, his rifle held at the ready. "Park, what's your status?" the soldier asked. His tone was professional, but Myra detected an undercurrent of suspicion. "Nothing here, Corporal," Park replied smoothly. "Just checking some tracks that turned out to be animal sign." He gestured toward the ground, where the rocky terrain showed no obvious footprints. The pilot definitely didn't come this way. The corporal nodded and moved on, but Myra noticed that he kept glancing back over his shoulder. Park had bought them time, but not much. They needed to make their next move quickly. "I need to get back to the search," Park whispered. "But I'll create an opportunity for you to contact the network. Monitor frequency 247.8 at 2100 hours. Use the code phrase Steel Guardian and wait for a response." Myra memorized the information, her mind already working through the logistics of long-range communication from her current position. "What about you? Won't they suspect something when I disappear?" Park's smile was grim. "Ma'am, I've been in Black Ops for 12 years. I know how to sell a story." He paused, his expression becoming serious. "But Captain, you need to understand what you're signing up for. These people have killed to protect their secret, and they won't hesitate to do it again. If you choose to fight, there's no guarantee you'll survive to see your daughter again." The weight of his words settled over Myra like a heavy blanket. She thought about Alina, about the bedtime stories she'd never told, the graduations she'd never attend, the weddings she'd never dance at. But she also thought about all the other pilots who might die if this corruption continued unchecked, all the other daughters who might lose their mothers to preventable conflicts. "Sergeant Park," she said quietly, "I became a pilot to protect people. That doesn't stop just because someone wants me dead." Park nodded, understanding passing between them. "Steel doesn't bend," he said, repeating Rivera's old motto. "It either holds or it breaks clean." "And I'm not ready to break," Myra replied. As Park disappeared back toward the search area, Myra began planning her next move. The radio frequency would be her lifeline to the network, but she needed to survive until 2100 hours. That meant staying hidden, staying mobile, and staying one step ahead of people who had every advantage except one. They didn't know they were hunting a ghost who refused to stay dead. The sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky, and Captain Myra Steelwing Thorne prepared for the fight of her life. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the Blackhawk helicopters continuing their search, their crews unaware that their target was already planning her next move. The game had changed, but Myra had always been good at adapting to new rules. She checked her watch, 14 hours until the scheduled contact. 14 hours to prepare for a war she'd never wanted but couldn't avoid. The mark of steel on her uniform represented more than just a call sign now. It was a promise. A promise that some lines couldn't be crossed, some truths couldn't be buried, and some pilots couldn't be silenced. The hunt was on, but the hunters were about to discover that they'd awakened something far more dangerous than a survivor. They'd awakened a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Myra Steelwing Thorne melted back into the shadows, her mind already focused on the battle ahead. The mark of steel would either be her salvation or her epitaph, but it would never be surrendered without a fight. The afternoon heat shimmered across the valley floor as Myra watched the search teams through her improvised periscope, a shard of mirror from her Apache's instrument panel wedged into a crack in the rocks. The soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their search pattern expanding in careful increments. She counted 4 teams of 4 men each, all armed with assault rifles and communication equipment. Professional, efficient, and utterly convinced they were hunting a dead woman. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Myra had spent her career learning to be invisible, flying low-altitude missions behind enemy lines, using terrain to mask her approach, striking without warning. Now those same skills were keeping her alive in a different kind of war, one where the enemy wore familiar uniforms and spoke with American accents. Her radio crackled with intercepted communications. Blackhawk lead, this is Ground Team Alpha. We've swept sectors 7 through 12. No sign of the pilot or additional remains. The voice was calm, professional, giving no indication of the deadly game being played in the rocks below. Myra shifted her position, moving like a shadow between the scattered boulders. Her flight suit was torn and stained with 3 days of survival in hostile territory, but the fabric still bore the patches that marked her as one of the elite. The steel wing insignia on her shoulder caught the afternoon light, a reminder of the woman she'd been before the world turned upside down. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Alina 3 weeks ago via satellite phone. Her daughter had been excited about a school project on aviation history, full of questions about different types of helicopters and their capabilities. "Mom, will you teach me to fly someday?" Alina had asked. "I want to be just like you." The memory strengthened Myra's resolve. She wouldn't let her daughter grow up in a world where corruption and murder were accepted as necessary evils. If that meant fighting a shadow war against her own military, then so be it. Steel didn't bend, and neither did the woman who wore its mark. The radio frequency park had given her remain silent, but Myra wasn't concerned. Professional networks operated on strict schedules, and 2100 hours was still 6 hours away. She used the time to inventory her resources: 1 sidearm with 2 magazines, a survival knife, basic medical supplies, and enough water for another day. Not much to wage war with, but she'd worked with less. Her biggest advantage was something the search teams couldn't account for. She knew this terrain intimately. The valley had been her area of operations for 8 months, and she'd memorized every ridge, every cave, every possible landing zone. The rocks that provided her concealment were the same ones she'd used as navigation landmarks during countless missions. Movement in the distance caught her attention. One of the Blackhawks was lifting off, its rotor wash creating a dust storm that obscured the valley floor. Myra watched it climb steadily, then bank toward the northwest. Either they were expanding their search area or reporting back to headquarters. Neither possibility was encouraging. The remaining helicopters maintained their positions, their crews providing overwatch for the ground teams. Myra studied their formation, noting the subtle differences that marked them as something other than standard military aircraft. The electronic warfare equipment mounted on their pylons was too sophisticated for routine operations, and the crew's radio discipline was too tight for a simple search and rescue. These were Black Ops birds, the kind that didn't officially exist and left no paper trail. If she was killed during this operation, her death would remain classified for decades. Alina would never know the truth about what happened to her mother or why she died. The thought sent cold fury through Myra's veins. A flash of movement on the ridge above caught her attention. Someone was approaching her position, moving with the deliberate care of a professional soldier. Myra's hand moved to her sidearm, but she hesitated when she recognized the figure. It was Park, and he was alone. The sergeant worked his way down the slope, using hand signals to indicate that he wasn't being followed. When he reached her position, he was breathing hard but smiling. Ma'am, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want first? Bad news, Myra replied without hesitation. I've learned to appreciate good news more when I know what I'm up against. Park nodded approvingly. The bad news is that this operation is being run by a unit that doesn't officially exist. They've got unlimited resources and no oversight. If they can't find your body, they'll manufacture evidence that you died in the crash. The implications hit Myra immediately. Once her death was officially confirmed, any evidence she might provide would be dismissed as fabricated. She'd be fighting ghosts with the testimony of a dead woman. And the good news: the network has been monitoring their communications. We know who's behind this and we know why they want you dead. Park's expression was grim but determined. More importantly, we know how to stop them. Myra felt a surge of hope tempered by caution. What do you need from me? Your mission data, Park replied. The photos you took over the Khyber Pass were transmitted to a secure server before your Apache was hit. The corruption goes all the way to the Pentagon, but the network has people in place who can act on solid evidence. The technical details were encouraging, but Myra sensed there was more to the story. What aren't you telling me, Sergeant? Park's smile faded. The evidence has to be delivered personally. Electronic transmission can be intercepted or discredited. We need someone who can testify to the chain of custody, someone whose word can't be questioned. The full scope of what he was asking began to dawn on Myra. You want me to surface, to come back from the dead and face these people directly? Not immediately, Park said quickly. We need time to prepare, to position our people and gather additional evidence. But eventually, yes, you'll have to step forward and tell your story. Myra considered the proposal, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Remaining dead would keep her safe but accomplish nothing. Surfacing would expose her to deadly enemies but might prevent other innocent deaths. The choice seemed obvious when she thought about it in those terms. What's the timeline? She asked. Park checked his watch. 72 hours. We need that long to coordinate with assets in Washington and prepare a media strategy. When you surface, it has to be with maximum impact. No second chances. The plan was ambitious, but Myra could see its logic. A dead pilot's accusations could be dismissed, but a living witness with documented evidence would be much harder to silence. The key was staying alive long enough to tell her story. How do I contact the network? She asked. Park reached into his equipment vest and withdrew a small device that looked like a standard military radio, but bore subtle modifications. Encrypted satellite communicator. It's linked to a secure network that can't be monitored by conventional means. The frequency changes every 4 hours, but the device handles that automatically. Myra examined the communicator, noting the military-grade construction and civilian electronics. Someone had invested serious money in this equipment, suggesting that the network had resources beyond what she'd imagined. Who's funding this operation? People who believe in the oath we all took, Park replied. Military personnel, intelligence operatives, even some politicians who remember what honor means. The colonel started small, but the network has grown. Your situation isn't unique, Captain. There are others like you, people who have seen too much and paid the price for their integrity. The revelation was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant she wasn't alone in her fight. Disturbing because it suggested that corruption in the military was far more widespread than she'd realized. How many others had died to protect secrets that should have been exposed? What's my immediate mission? She asked, falling back on the familiar structure of military operations. Park's expression became businesslike. Survive the next 72 hours. Stay mobile, avoid contact with the search teams, and maintain communication with the network. At 2100 hours tonight, you'll receive detailed instructions for the next phase. The sound of approaching rotor blades interrupted their conversation. Another Blackhawk was approaching, flying a search pattern that would bring it directly over their position. Park quickly shouldered his rifle and adopted the posture of a soldier continuing his search. "I need to get back to my team," he said quietly. "They'll expect me to report in soon." He paused, studying Myra's face. "Ma'am, I want you to know that whatever happens, you're not alone in this fight. The network has your back." "And I have theirs," Myra replied. The exchange felt like a binding oath, two soldiers committing to a cause larger than themselves. Park nodded and began working his way back up the slope. Within minutes, he disappeared into the maze of rocks and scrub brush, leaving Myra alone with her thoughts and the encrypted communicator. She tested the device briefly, confirming its operation before settling back into her concealment. The afternoon shadows grew longer as she waited for darkness. The search teams continued their methodical work, but their movements suggested growing frustration. They'd been hunting for hours without finding any trace of their target, and professional soldiers didn't like missions that dragged on without resolution. Myra used the time to plan her next moves. The communicator gave her a lifeline to the network, but she still needed to survive 3 days in hostile territory while being hunted by people who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The challenge was daunting, but she'd faced worse odds before. Her thoughts turned to Alina, to the promise she'd made to come home safely. The mission had changed, but the promise remained. She would survive this ordeal, expose the corruption that had claimed so many lives, and return to her daughter with honor intact. The mark of steel demanded nothing less. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Captain Myra, Steelwing Thorn, prepared for the longest night of her life. The real battle was just beginning, and she intended to be ready for whatever came next. The communicator remained silent, but she could feel the network's presence like a protective shield around her. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for every pilot who died carrying secrets, every soldier who'd been silenced for telling the truth, every family who'd lost someone to preventable conflicts. The mark of steel represented more than personal achievement now. It was a symbol of resistance, a promise that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost, and Myra Thorn had never been one to break her promises. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky as 2100 hours approached. Somewhere in the valley below, the search teams were settling into defensive positions for the night. They believed they were hunting a dead woman, but they were about to discover that ghosts could be very dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Myra checked the communicator one final time, then settled back to wait for the signal that would begin the next phase of her war. The night was young, and she had work to do. As the ancient Afghan peak stood sentinel over the valley, a lone figure moved through the darkness with the grace of a predator. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, but this time, the prey was fighting back. The encrypted communicator came alive at exactly 2100 hours, its soft chime barely audible above the night sounds of the valley. Myra pressed the device to her ear, her heart rate steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. "Steel Guardian to Steelwing," the voice said, using the code phrase Park had given her. "Do you copy?" "Steelwing copies," Myra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm secure and ready for instructions." "Understood. This is Control. We've been monitoring the search operation and have confirmed your situation. Are you prepared for immediate extraction?" The question caught Myra off guard. Part of her wanted nothing more than to escape this nightmare, to disappear into the network's protective embrace and never look back. But that would mean abandoning the fight, leaving the corruption unexposed and the guilty unpunished. "Negative, Control. I'm staying to finish this mission." There was a pause before the voice responded, and Myra detected a note of approval. "Copy that, Steelwing. We hoped you'd say that. Your courage has been noted at the highest levels of our organization." The phrase "highest levels" intrigued Myra. Just how far did this network extend? What are my orders? Phase 1 involves intelligence gathering. The search teams hunting you are using equipment that's not supposed to exist. We need proof of their capabilities and their real mission parameters. Myra considered the tactical implications. Getting close enough to document the enemy's equipment would mean exposing herself to capture or death. But the intelligence value could be enormous, potentially exposing a much larger conspiracy than anyone had imagined. What kind of proof do you need? Photographs, serial numbers, communication intercepts, anything that proves these aren't standard military assets. The voice paused. We know it's dangerous, but you're the only one in position to gather this intelligence. The challenge was daunting, but not impossible. Myra had conducted reconnaissance missions in far more dangerous circumstances, and her survival training had prepared her for exactly this type of operation. The difference was that this time, she was operating without backup or official sanction. "I'll need until dawn to position myself properly," she said. "Can you provide overwatch or support?" Negative. The network operates on a strict compartmentalization protocol. If you're captured, we can't risk exposure of our other assets. The cold reality of her situation settled over Myra like a shroud. She was truly alone, fighting a shadow war against enemies who had every advantage except one. They didn't know they were being hunted by someone who'd already died once. Understood. What's the exfiltration plan? Rendezvous Point Alpha is a caves complex 3 kilometers north of your current position. If you can reach it with the intelligence we need, we can extract you within 6 hours. Myra pulled out her map and studied the terrain. The caves were in Taliban-controlled territory, which meant she'd be trading one set of enemies for another. But the insurgents were predictable compared to the shadow operatives hunting her now. Control, I need to know something. How many others have died because of what I photographed? Another pause, longer this time. Steelwing, that information is classified above your clearance level. What I can tell you is that your mission has the potential to save thousands of lives. The weight of responsibility settled on Myra's shoulders. She thought about Alina, about the promise she'd made to come home safely. But she also thought about all the other mothers who'd sent their children to war, trusting that the military would protect them. That trust had been betrayed, and someone had to pay the price. Roger that, Control. I'll gather the intelligence and proceed to the rendezvous point. Steelwing, one more thing. Your call sign. It wasn't chosen randomly. Colonel Rivera specifically requested that designation for you. He said you were the only pilot he'd ever met who could bend without breaking. The revelation hit Myra like a physical blow. Rivera had been planning for this moment even before his death, positioning his best pilot for a mission that would require every skill she'd ever learned. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the honor. "I won't let him down," she said simply. "None of us will. Steel Guardian out." The communicator went silent, leaving Myra alone with her thoughts and the enormity of her task. She had perhaps 8 hours of darkness to infiltrate a military operation, gather intelligence, and escape to a rendezvous point in enemy territory. The odds were terrible, but she'd faced worse. She began her approach to the search team's position, moving with the patience of a predator. The night vision equipment the soldiers were using gave them an advantage, but Myra had learned to use darkness as an ally rather than an obstacle. She became one with the shadows, a ghost seeking vengeance. The first checkpoint was a 2-man team positioned on a ridge overlooking the valley. Myra studied their equipment through her improvised scope, noting the sophisticated communication gear and weapons that were definitely not standard issue. These soldiers were equipped for a Black Ops mission, not a simple search and rescue. She photographed everything with a small digital camera from her survival kit, being careful to capture serial numbers and manufacturer markings. The evidence was damning. weapons and equipment that officially didn't exist, being used by soldiers who weren't supposed to be in Afghanistan. The second checkpoint proved more challenging. The soldiers had positioned themselves in a natural choke point, making it impossible to approach without being detected. Myra spent an hour studying their patrol patterns before finding a gap in their coverage, a 15-second window when both sentries were looking in the wrong direction. She moved like liquid shadow, covering 30 meters of open ground without making a sound. The soldiers never knew she'd passed within arm's reach of their position. Professional competence was one thing, but what Myra possessed went beyond training. She had the instincts of a born hunter. The command post was her primary objective, a cluster of vehicles and communication equipment that served as the nerve center for the operation. Getting close enough to document their capabilities would be the most dangerous part of her mission, but also the most important. She found a position on a low ridge that provided clear sight lines to the command post. The activity below was impressive. Banks of computers, satellite communication arrays, and electronic warfare equipment that belonged in a Pentagon facility, not a field operation in Afghanistan. The scope of the operation was staggering. Myra counted at least 20 personnel, all wearing unmarked uniforms and carrying weapons she didn't recognize. The command vehicle bore no identifying markings, but the electronic signature was unmistakable. This was military intelligence equipment of the highest classification level. Through her camera's telephoto lens, she documented everything. Serial numbers on communication equipment, faces of personnel, vehicle identification numbers that had been partially obscured but were still readable. The evidence was building into a comprehensive picture of an operation that violated every rule of military engagement. A new voice crackled through the radio frequencies she was monitoring. Raven leader to all units. Priority target has been upgraded to Alpha status. Lethal force authorized if necessary for mission completion. The transmission was encrypted, but Myra's equipment could decode military standard protocols. The authorization for lethal force confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an assassination operation disguised as a recovery effort. The soldiers hunting her had been given permission to kill an American officer to protect whatever secrets she'd uncovered. Myra felt a cold fury building in her chest. These people weren't just corrupt, they were traitors. They'd betrayed their oath, their country, and their fellow soldiers. The mark of steel on her uniform represented everything they'd abandoned: honor, duty, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than personal gain. The command post was too well guarded for a direct approach, but Myra had learned patience during her years of combat flying. She waited, watching the patrol patterns and noting the gaps in their security. Professional soldiers were predictable in their professionalism, and that predictability could be exploited. At 0200 hours, the guard rotation provided her opportunity. For exactly 90 seconds, the eastern approach to the command post would be unobserved. It wasn't much time, but it was enough for someone with her training and motivation. She moved like a shadow made flesh, covering the open ground in a sprint that would have impressed her drill instructors. The communication equipment was her primary target, a bank of computers and satellite arrays that processed the intelligence feeding this operation. The data ports were secured, but not against someone with Myra's technical training. Helicopter pilots learned to interface with multiple computer systems, and the skills translated well to intelligence gathering. She inserted a small device into the primary data stream, a piece of equipment the network had provided for exactly this situation. The device worked silently, copying terabytes of classified information in seconds. Communications logs, personnel records, financial data, mission parameters, everything needed to expose the conspiracy was flowing into the network's secure servers. A footstep behind her made Myra freeze. Someone was approaching the command post, moving with the deliberate pace of a security patrol. She had perhaps 10 seconds before discovery, not enough time to retreat but sufficient for one final act of defiance. She activated the camera's burst mode, photographing everything in sight. The screen displays showing financial transactions, the personnel roster listing names she recognized from Pentagon briefings, the mission orders that explicitly authorized the murder of American military personnel. "Hey, stop right there." The voice was young, nervous, probably a soldier who'd never expected to encounter resistance during a routine patrol. Myra spun to face the threat, her hand moving instinctively to her sidearm. The soldier was perhaps 25, his rifle trained on her center mass but his finger not yet on the trigger. Professional training warred with human hesitation in his eyes. "I'm Captain Myra Thorne, United States Army," she said quietly. "I'm an American officer and I surrender." The soldier's confusion was evident. His briefings had told him to expect a dead pilot, not a living officer claiming surrender. The momentary hesitation was all Myra needed to assess her situation and plan her next move. "Control, this is Bravo 7, the soldier said into his radio. "I have a female individual at the command post. She claims to be the target pilot." The response was immediate and chilling. "Bravo 7, you are authorized to use lethal force. Eliminate the target immediately." Myra watched the soldier's face change as he processed the order. Whatever he'd been told about this mission, it hadn't included murdering unarmed American officers. The conflict between his training and his conscience played out in his expression. "Sir, the target is unarmed and claims to be surrendering," he said into the radio. "Request clarification on rules of engagement." "Bravo 7, you have your orders. Eliminate the target now." The soldier's rifle wavered slightly, his military training warring with his basic humanity. Myra could see the moment of decision approaching, the point where he would either follow orders or follow his conscience. "Son," she said softly, "I'm an American pilot. I have a daughter who thinks I'm dead. Whatever they told you about this mission, it's a lie." The words hit their target. The soldier's rifle lowered slightly, doubt creeping into his eyes. "Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening here." "Neither did I until 3 days ago," Myra replied. "But I know that American soldiers don't murder other American soldiers. That's what separates us from our enemies." The radio crackled with increasing urgency. "Bravo 7, respond immediately. Eliminate the target and return to your post." The soldier looked at his radio, then at Myra, then back at the radio. The conflict was tearing him apart, but Myra could see which way he was leaning. Professional soldiers were trained to follow orders, but they were also trained to recognize illegal commands. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands where I can see them," he said finally. "I'm going to call for my squad leader." It wasn't the outcome Myra had hoped for, but it wasn't the worst-case scenario either. The soldier had chosen to follow procedure rather than execute an unarmed prisoner. That decision might save both their lives. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the tense standoff. Multiple engines, moving fast and coordinated. Someone had decided that the situation required immediate escalation. "Bravo 7, maintain your position," the radio commanded. "Containment team is en route to your location." Myra understood the implications immediately. A containment team meant specialists trained to handle situations that required permanent solutions. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate both her and the soldier who'd failed to follow orders. "Soldier, what's your name?" she asked quietly. "Private First Class Johnson, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Johnson, I need you to understand something. In about 2 minutes, a team is going to arrive here with orders to kill both of us. Me because I know too much, and you because you've seen too much." The young soldier's eyes widened as the implications hit him. That's not possible. We're American military. So was I, until I photographed the wrong convoy, Myra said grimly. Johnson, you have about 90 seconds to decide whether you're going to be a victim or a survivor. The sound of the approaching vehicles was getting louder. Myra could identify at least 3 different engine signatures, probably tactical vehicles carrying a full assault team. Once they arrived, any chance of escape would disappear. "What do you want me to do?" Johnson asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Help me get out of here alive," Myra replied. "In return, I'll make sure the world knows that Private First Class Johnson died trying to do the right thing." The soldier's face went pale as he processed the full scope of what was happening. He'd enlisted to serve his country, not to participate in assassinations of American officers. The choice between duty and conscience was destroying him. "Ma'am, I can't," he stammered. "Johnson, look at me," Myra said firmly. "You're a good soldier. You've followed orders your entire career. But some orders are illegal and following them makes you a criminal, not a soldier." The vehicles were close now, their headlights visible through the darkness. Time was running out for both of them. "Johnson, I need an answer now," Myra pressed. "Are you going to help me escape, or are you going to watch them murder an American officer?" The young soldier's face hardened with resolve. "Ma'am, I didn't sign up to be a murderer." "Neither did I," Myra replied. "But we're about to become victims if we don't move now." Johnson shouldered his rifle and gestured toward the eastern slope. "There's a path down the ridge. It leads to a dry riverbed that runs north for about 2 kilometers. "What about you?" Myra asked. "I'll buy you time," Johnson said simply. "It's the least I can do." Myra felt a surge of admiration for the young soldier. He'd chosen conscience over career, honor over survival. "Johnson, that's not necessary. Come with me." "No, ma'am. Someone needs to slow them down, and I'm the only one in position to do it." His voice was steady now, filled with the calm of someone who'd made peace with his decision. The vehicles were less than a minute away. Myra could hear the tactical teams preparing for deployment, their voices carrying the professional calm of operators who'd done this before. "Johnson, if you're going to do this, make it count," she said. "Tell them I went south toward the main road. That'll buy me an extra hour." The soldier nodded. "Yes, ma'am, and Captain, give them hell." Myra felt tears threatening but pushed them back. There would be time for grief later. Right now, she had a mission to complete and a young soldier's sacrifice to honor. She moved toward the eastern slope, pausing only to look back at Johnson. He was positioning himself behind the communication equipment, his rifle trained on the approaching vehicles. Whatever happened next, he would die as a soldier. The descent down the ridge was treacherous in the darkness, but Myra's night vision had adapted to the conditions. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years navigating hostile terrain, each step calculated to minimize noise and maximize speed. Behind her, the sound of the assault team's arrival echoed through the valley. Shouted orders, slamming doors, the distinctive sound of weapons being charged. Then Johnson's voice, calm and professional. "Halt! Identify yourselves." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, the muzzle flashes illuminating the command post like deadly fireworks. Johnson's rifle answered briefly, then fell silent. Myra paused in her descent, offering a silent prayer for the young soldier who'd chosen honor over survival. His sacrifice had bought her precious time, but it had also bought her something more valuable, proof that not everyone in the military had lost their way. The assault team would discover her deception within minutes, but by then she'd be deep in the maze of ridges and valleys that formed the Afghan landscape. The terrain that had protected her for 3 days would shield her again, at least long enough to reach the rendezvous point. She activated the encrypted communicator as she reached the bottom of the ridge. "Control, this is Steelwing. Mission accomplished. Intelligence package is en route to your servers. Copy that, Steelwing. We're monitoring the situation. Are you injured? Negative, but I've got company. They'll be tracking me within the hour. Understood. Proceed to Rendezvous Point Alpha. Extraction team is standing by. Myra checked her compass and began moving north toward the cave complex. The terrain was rough, but she'd navigated worse during her survival training. The difference was that this time, failure meant more than just a poor grade. It meant the truth would die with her. The communication device that had copied the intelligence data was her most valuable asset now. The information it contained could expose corruption at the highest levels of the military hierarchy, but only if she survived long enough to deliver it. She thought about Johnson as she moved through the darkness, about the choice he'd made and the price he'd paid. How many others had died to protect the secrets she'd uncovered? How many more would die if those secrets remained buried? The mark of steel on her uniform felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of representing everyone who'd been betrayed by the system they'd sworn to serve. Rivera, Johnson, herself, they were all casualties of a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. But they weren't the only ones fighting. The network existed because others had recognized the threat and chosen to resist. Park, the voice on the radio, the extraction team waiting at the rendezvous point, all of them were proof that honor still existed in the military, even if it had to operate in shadows. The caves were still 2 kilometers away, but Myra could already hear the sounds of pursuit behind her. Helicopters were lifting off from the command post, their rotors cutting through the night air with mechanical precision. They would have thermal imaging, night vision, and every advantage technology could provide. But they didn't have what she had, the desperate fury of a mother who refused to let her daughter inherit a world where truth was a casualty of war. The mark of steel had become more than just a symbol now. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of war against everyone who'd betrayed the oath they'd sworn. Captain Myra, Steelwing, Thorne disappeared into the Afghan night, carrying with her the evidence that could topple governments and the determination to see justice done. The hunt was far from over, but the hunted had become the hunter. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. But in the darkness ahead, she could see the first faint glimmer of dawn, not just of a new day, but of a new chapter in the war between truth and corruption. The mark of steel would either be her salvation or her epitaph, but it would never be surrendered. Some promises were worth dying for, and some fights were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Steel doesn't bend. It either holds or it breaks clean. And Myra Thorne had no intention of breaking.